Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm History with Hilbert, and today I want to take a look at the question of, was Elizabeth I well established by 1571, or were the years here a bit of a crisis situation for the Queen? Now I will do some comparison in this as well, but I'm going to look at this in a theme by theme kind of way, and again this is up until 1571, so bear that in mind. Now first of all, actually Queen Elizabeth I was indeed illegitimate, and not just in the Catholic sense, but also technically in the Protestant sense. In the Catholic way, she's illegitimate because Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn, who was the Protestant who caused Henry VIII, or it's the main reason why Henry VIII broke from Rome and tried to get an annulment, essentially a divorce, with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. However, the Pope wouldn't let him do this for several other reasons, and essentially then this marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, her mother, was seen as being illegitimate, and because it was illegitimate, it was then seen that the product of this marriage, i.e. Elizabeth, was also illegitimate, and that she therefore wouldn't be allowed to rule the country. Now for Catholics this was an issue, and this is pretty much the big reason why Elizabeth I decided to rule on a Protestant basis, because she literally couldn't rule on a Catholic basis because she was illegitimate in that sense. Now, on the Protestant sense as well, actually, she is technically illegitimate, although it's less of an issue in this way, and not that many people know about it. She is illegitimate because her father had her declared illegitimate after beheading her mother, Anne Boleyn, which went down, I think, about 4 months after Catherine of Aragon died herself, so it's quite interesting how that went down. And then obviously he would then want to declare illegitimate the product of the marriage again, and he was the head of the Church in England. Of course, the monarch in the Church of England is the head rather than the Pope in Rome, which is the big difference between the Anglo-Catholicism and Roman Catholicism, and obviously then Protestantism as well. So technically she's illegitimate there, which is another point, but really that wasn't as essential and as important as the Catholic one, because most Protestants were more than happy to have Elizabeth on the throne. So the next big issue that I'm going to look at is her religious stance. Now, in this video, I would like to point out I'm mainly going to be arguing that it was. You could obviously take some of these points and flip them around and say, aha, but you can also argue from the other side, which is very true with this one, that she had a lot of people on various sides of the religious divide in England. She had some very moderate Catholics, moderate Protestants, and then at the same time, very radical Catholics, so like the Jesuits, who would come a bit later, and counter-reformers, but also some Marians or Puritans on the radical Protestant side, who would want radical Protestant legislature and clerical changes added, whereas the Catholics would want to go back to how the church had been under her sister, for example, Mary I, and then before that under Henry VIII, before he had changed things after the break with Rome, sort of around the 1530s, that kind of area. And now you can say that while she did this, and while there was no great big, well, there were a few rebellions, but, you know, she wasn't overthrown because she annoyed one side too much. However, pretty much everyone was unhappy with it, even the moderates on both sides. Most people in England, and I'll get onto this later, were Catholic, and most of them were annoyed because England was officially a Protestant country. Now you had the Protestants who were annoyed because most other people were Catholic and they were in a minority. And then you had the radicals on both sides who were also annoyed because the radicals wanted, on the Catholic side, obviously to depose Elizabeth, which they tried several times to do. And the radical Protestants, they didn't think she was doing enough to get rid of the Catholics or to convert the Catholics, or to introduce more legislature that was very Protestant in nature, as had been done most vehemently under the Duke of Northumberland under Edward's reign. But there were obviously various Catholics of different stripes of zealotry or conviction in the country, which I will also get onto in just a minute. And while she, like I said, couldn't anger one group too much, pretty much everyone was unhappy with the way it went. So even though she didn't anger anyone, you know, more than she should have done, or perhaps she did, pretty much no one was happy with it in the end. Now, what was Elizabeth's foreign stance? Now, her expedition to France in 1562 to get involved with essentially the French Civil War between the Huguenots, who were French Protestants, and essentially the French Catholics, went very badly. She captured the port city of Le Havre, which is in northern France. She was hoping to trade that for Calais, which had been taken from the English, I believe, during Mary I's reign, when she got involved with the wars in Europe because of the Spanish, because she was married to Philip. But essentially this went really badly for Elizabeth because the French Protestants who she was there to support, who were her allies, decided to turn on her and sided with the Catholics. So that ended in failure. And this was all obviously before the 1571 end date. Now, Elizabeth had no real allies in Europe. Now, you could say, well, you know, they got on quite well with the French at one point, which is mostly after this period, and some of the German states. Yes, this is true. They were more friendly with Dutch rebels and German states in the north, but these places didn't really have a lot of power on the European scale. If you contrast this to, say, Henry VII, when he was making alliances with the Spanish at various points. The Spanish at this point were the most powerful country in the world. England had usually tried to sort of stay between the French and the Spanish, and to make sure, because obviously the Spanish had a very strong connection with the Holy Roman Empire, which was the other big faction in Europe. They were usually relatively friendly with at least one of these three big countries. But during Elizabeth's reign, we don't really see that. Obviously, the Spanish are the big enemies. They are friendlier with the French, but still the relationship deteriorates. And the Holy Roman Empire are pretty much on the same level as Spain during this period. So that's one point to consider, that she wasn't very stable because she didn't really have many allies. Now, the Spanish were increasingly hostile to the English, as I mentioned, and they had several opportunities to actually invade England. Now, during this time you have, or a little bit later, you have the revolts in the Netherlands, which would be the start of the 80 Years' War. And the Spanish controlled both the southern and the northern Netherlands at this point. It's 1572 when Alva verloor zijn bril, which means Alva lost his glasses. Bril is glasses in Dutch, but it's also a sort of a similar word to Den Briel, which is the first city that the watergeuzen, or the sea beggars in English, managed to capture, which essentially started off the second phase of the 80 Years' War. But essentially they had deep water harbours in the Netherlands, like at Vlissingen, or in English you call it Flushing. They could obviously send a fleet to England and get involved, which they almost did in the Northern Rebellion when the rebels tried to reach Hartlepool. Hartlepool is on the coast, so the Spanish could send troops there, and if the Spanish had landed, this would have been huge issues. And because the Spanish were increasingly hostile, it means that Elizabeth isn't that well established on the throne, because there are foreign powers trying to kick her off the throne. And also she failed to help the Dutch rebels, something that I'm quite bitter about, until much, much later. I think it's 1585 when she sends the first troops over. And this wasn't just bad because, you know, she didn't help out the Dutch, and, you know, Dutch and English old cousins, so it's bad crack. But also because the Dutch, or the Flemish, or the Burgundians, or whichever amalgamation of them you like to choose, they were England's oldest and best trading partners, especially in the wool or the cloth trade. And because of the war in Spain, all of this ground to a halt, and England lost out on a lot of money because of this, which was really quite a stupid move. If Elizabeth had maybe got involved first, sent the navy in to deal with the Spanish, then perhaps the war could have been wrapped up quicker and trade could have resumed. And we all know the economic boom that occurred in the new Dutch Republic after the 80 Years' War. Perhaps Elizabeth could have had some of the profits of that, but no. So, moving on, I would like to have a look also at the Catholic Menace during this time. And as I mentioned before, the majority of English people at the time were Catholic, although the levels of opposition varied greatly, as I mentioned, different stripes of zealotry. Now, the majority of the population went to church, and it was actually illegal not to go to church. And the church, because Elizabeth was Protestant, were Protestant services, and they read from the Common Book of Prayer, which was the main Protestant liturgy of the time. But most people who went to church were what was called church papists. You were fined if you didn't go to church, which I will bring up later. So most people went to church but didn't actually believe in what they were being told. They were probably sitting at the back reciting the Ave Maria and not actually getting involved in the Protestant service. They didn't believe in what was going on. They disagreed with the services, and most of the 8,000 clergy at the time in England were church papists. They were conforming to the Protestant services, but really they were just Catholic. Now, the majority of the nobility throughout the country were Catholic, and they could afford the fine. and they would not go to church. Obviously, the fine wasn't very high, so if you're a commoner, you couldn't afford it, so you'd be a church papist if you were committed to the Catholic Church. But a nobleman could afford it, and so they became what was known as church recusants, where they just wouldn't go to church. And this was even more dangerous because this is open opposition, which again shows that her consolidation of power wasn't very strong if so many, in fact the vast majority of the nobility, were openly refusing to abide by these laws that she'd set in place. Whether she was really bothered about whether people actually followed the laws or whether she just did this to appease the Protestants is another question, which I will leave to you. So, a woman in a man's world. Now, obviously, Elizabeth, when she was ruling, lived in an age when people very much debated whether women could actually rule at all. Obviously, Mary had come before, but I will look at that in a little bit more detail later on. But she was essentially very much reliant on her councillors, on her privy council, and they actually do most of the ruling of the country during the time. And actually a very good example of this would be when Cecil and Walsingham's spy networks save her lives. I'll get onto one or two of the plots later on as well. Now, as I said, people doubted that women could rule during this period. They'd obviously forgotten the Anglo-Saxon period when you had essentially warrior queens like Athelflaed, who, they're pretty surely, we were quite sure that she led armies and things like this. But during the Tudor era, people weren't so sure. And you had a lot of very powerful men who were very power hungry, and they obviously tried to control the Queen, and in some ways they were very successful in doing this. So you wonder if it's actually the Queen whose authority is being asserted, or really the councillors pulling the strings, councillors like Cecil or Leicester or Walsingham. And obviously it was harder for Elizabeth to earn respect because she was in a very physical, practical sense of the early Renaissance, late medieval period, that she wouldn't go out and couldn't go out and fight. Because obviously Henry VII had gone out and won his crown at Bosworth. He had actively fought. It was his, it was Richard III who charged into him, but he was very close. He was probably mere feet away from Richard III, the other king. Obviously this was completely different to having a woman ruler. Henry VIII as well, he apparently, whether he actually did, led the charge at, it's not the Golden Spurs, it's called something similar. I can't remember, I might put it on the screen if I can remember to do that. But in France he also led a charge, so obviously it's a different situation. It's harder for Elizabeth to earn respect in the kind of martial sense of this, although she does very well later on with things like the Armada, but obviously that's after 1571. So obviously the lack of an heir created a problem, and this was directly down to her not marrying, or rather the other way round. So this created a few problems. She couldn't create any alliances with foreign powers because if she didn't marry, then she couldn't cement this bond between the families. So if you look back at Henry VII, he, for example, one of the first things he does is get married to Elizabeth of York to sort of start to heal the divide. And actually you can see in that picture the Tudor rose. The red rose of Lancaster, the white rose of York symbolically come together with Henry VII, who is from the Lancastrian side, from the Tudors, and then you have obviously Elizabeth of York, who was the, let me get this right, the daughter of Edward V, who was the son of Richard Plantagenet, who'd been one of the, essentially the main guy who started the Wars of the Roses. But Elizabeth, because she didn't marry, couldn't create any of these alliances. Henry VIII as well married Catherine of Aragon, created an alliance with the Spanish, very handy move when he was attacking the French. But Elizabeth couldn't do this because she didn't marry. And again, she didn't have any children, so she couldn't marry any children off to strengthen their alliances with other countries either, which was also an issue. And because of this, there was no heir to the throne. I think I might have muddled these up. Yes, I did. But because of this, there was no heir to the throne, and this meant that other people, for example Essex, and a few others, would be vying for power at court. This created a huge amount of factionalism. Because people would know, oh, there's no one next in line. I don't need to essentially to suck up to anyone else, because if I play my cards right, I might be chosen as the next heir. And this created a real problem, because then it meant that people were really looking out for their own interests in this, rather than supporting the person who was chosen as heir. Now, also we need to look at the north. Those darn northerners are always causing us so much trouble. which sounds very familiar. Now, in 1569, the Northern Earls Northumberland and Westmoreland, these are the names of the earls, by the way, although both of these areas did rise up in rebellion, rebelled against the Queen. Now, it was mostly a religious, although you could argue actually that it was mostly secular as well. No, it's not making too much sense. But essentially, in a nutshell, you had all of these earls. A lot of the land in the north under Elizabeth was given to southern lords, to southern earls, some of the great northern magnates, the magnate earl families that had ruled the land essentially for hundreds of years, fought off the Scots countless amount of times, were replaced by southerners. Now you see a very interesting trend with modern history as well, but anyway. And they didn't like that very much, and they actually rose up in rebellion. There were a lot of other issues, though. Those are just some of the reasons. And they raised about 5,000 men of the Catholic North. It was very much majority Catholic in the North. And they brought them as far south as Bram and Moor, which isn't very far south, by the way. And this could have been a real issue, because they were aligned with Scottish Catholics, and their plan was essentially to get this guy Norfolk, who I believe he was the cousin to the Earl of Sussex, but don't quote me on that, to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and that they would then rule England. Although I believe the idea was not to depose Queen Elizabeth, but simply to have Mary, Queen of Scots put in as the heir. And they were very careful to do this so they weren't in blatant rebellion against the Queen. A bit like the Wars of the Roses at the start, when Richard Plantagenet marched down to St Albans and then London. He came down and knelt before the king after he had destroyed the king's army and said, "Oh Lord, I am doing this to get rid of the bad councillors, not to get rid of you. Please believe me." They didn't, by the way. And Queen Elizabeth didn't believe the Northern Earls either. Whether they were actually good intentioned and this was what they wanted, we aren't entirely sure. But there was a potential for foreign involvement. The Scottish Catholics very much hoped that the French would get involved. The Old Alliance is what it's called, the French and the Scottish working together, and there was a potential for this. Obviously, Mary had been married to the Dauphin of France, the Crown Prince of France, so there was that connection there. And many English Catholics thought that the Spanish might get involved. As I already mentioned, they had deep water harbours at Vlissingen and other places in the Spanish Netherlands, and they could send ships over and land them at Hartlepool, which is one of the locations the rebels tried to capture. And obviously as well, you had Mary, the Queen before, was married to Philip II, so there were contacts between England and Spain that was still there from the Catholic period under Mary, which wasn't that long ago. It had only been about just over a decade since that had come to an end. And obviously Scotland as well, there was a plot called the Ridolfi plot, which involved I believe a Venetian or a Genoan merchant who could travel around Europe, and he essentially concocted this plan to actually kill the Queen. He was also involved in planning the Northern Rising of the Northern Earls, and in this plan essentially he wanted to replace Elizabeth with again Norfolk, who was her own cousin. And he was actually in on the plot, which shows she wasn't very stable at all, because if he was in on the plot, well, that uncovers a huge weakness at the heart of her cousin, at the heart of her court, if her own cousin is plotting against her. And obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, is her other cousin, so you see that the family dynamic, they really don't like each other. And she actually killed her own cousin. Whether she did this on purpose, she claims that she didn't want the death warrant to be sent away, but she did sign it, so, it's a bit dubious. And essentially, what I'm trying to get at is they can't all be Henry VII. So if we compare sort of Elizabeth's early years, the first 13 years, to Henry VII's 13 years, you see quite a big difference. Now, I'm essentially a Henry VII fanboy, as you can probably tell from if you've been around that long, actually, it's almost a year. If you have, then comment something like Henry VII for the win, #Bosworth 14K85. But obviously he won his battle, as I mentioned, at Bosworth. In battle, he went out and fought. He was a legitimate king, albeit through his mother's side, but still it was a legitimate claim to the throne. He had several rebellions during the early time, but he crushed them quite successfully. Some of them came fairly close to London and involved foreign powers, But obviously, Henry comes into a very different situation to Elizabeth. Now, obviously, you can say with Elizabeth, it's harder. Now, I've mentioned that religious people of the country liked him. Well, yes, because this is before the Reformation, so he didn't have to deal with that. If Henry VII had come to a country where Catholics and Protestants were busy burning each other at the stake while saying mass for each other, it might have been a different situation. Elizabeth did have to deal with that. Henry didn't. But Henry had the Yorkists to deal with, and they were arguably just as bad, because the whole country had literally for the last roughly 30 years, they had been battering each other in. So he had to deal with that. And his approach was very different. He obviously had money in the bank. He was very hard-working. He was interested in the aspects of running a country that bored most other rulers, as Ronald Hutton says, which is very true. He was very interested in banking, in the accounts, economics, and it shows because he made so much money, which is where he gets his stingy kind of reputation from. He's just loaded, which is essentially a good thing because it allowed him to pay for armies, to get rid of the rebellions, and to be financially secure. And as you know, money wins wars. He had a strong and stable government. He had a spy network as well, which actually is something they have in common. Elizabeth and Henry both have spy networks that saved their lives on multiple occasions, which was good. But I think the big difference is that Henry got married very quickly and had babies on the way in the first 13 years. I believe 1502 when I think it's already somewhere in 1487 or somewhere in the late 1480s that his first child is born. This is Arthur. Now obviously Arthur would die in, I believe it's 1503 or 1502, and that would then leave the crown open to his other son, who was also called Henry, and that obviously is Big Henna, Henry VII. Henry the VIII, sorry. So that's one of the big differences between the two. Alright everyone, so I realise this video has been a bit rambly and whatnot, but I hope it's been useful and that we can all use this to our advantage for whatever competitions we may be entering with this knowledge. So yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this video about Elizabeth I and some of the issues she faced in the run-up to 1571, and also a little bit of context about that, of her reign of the time period, and then contrasting a little bit to that boy Henry VII. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and comment if you're interested, if you want to know anything else. And if you are new and you like what you heard, then thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you'll join us all again very soon.